Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, August 1st, 2024. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. This week, author Peter Symons joins us to take us back to the roots of brewing in Australia and to ask a provocative question: what is lager? Peter's latest book is called True Blue Brews, The Origins of Australian Beer. If you want to support us financially, check out patreon.com/basicbrewing, and many thanks to everybody who is helping out in that way. If you go to patreon.com/basicbrewing, you can see a long list of stuff that you can access if you sign up as a supporter. And many thanks to the new Patreon subscribers who are signing up every week. Your help is very much appreciated. Financial supporters have already seen the video episode I'm planning to post to the general public on Friday. It's the one where Steve and I taste my experiment in pasteurizing a fruit stout, attempting to use fruit juice to prime the beer bottles and to use pasteurization to stop the carbonation process before those bottles blow up. I have some really sad news about one of our Basic Brewing Video alumni, Ed Nicholson, who taught us how to make his delicious habanero hot sauce on our September 19th, 2014 video episode, has passed away. At the time we made that video 10 years ago, I had already been friends with Ed for more than 10 years. So I first met Ed working on a corporate video that he had written and was producing. I shot and edited it. On the first day of shooting, we had to spend several hours in the car together, and I really enjoyed talking with Ed. Turns out we had some things in common. He eventually was hired full-time to the company that I worked at, working in media and public relations. I found out that Ed was an extremely talented guitarist as well as a talented writer. He'd shut the door of his office during lunch hour and play folk music with his friend Stan, who would accompany him on the mandolin. And it was a wonderful thing hearing a bit of folk music wafting down the hallways of the otherwise sterile corporate office. It wasn't long before Ed brought in hot sauce, made from homegrown habaneros, in a recipe that he devised himself after just looking at the ingredients on a hot sauce bottle. It had an amount of heat that was a bit challenging at first, but the flavor of the sauce kept you coming back for another taste until your upper lip and your forehead was sweaty from the heat. It was that recipe that Ed later shared on our show. In the past few years, after I left that company, we kept in touch. We'd meet to swap homebrew for hot sauce, peppers, and even seeds. Ed grew a variety of peppers, from sweet all the way up to Carolina Reapers, which would make more than your upper lip and forehead sweat. I'm sure that Ed would be extremely uncomfortable if he knew that I'd be spending this much time talking about him. He was super soft-spoken, incredibly talented, generous, and genuinely the nicest guy you'd ever meet. So if you've made Ed's hot sauce recipe or used it as an inspiration for your own, raise a glass to Ed Nicholson. Okay, I don't think Ed would want us to be sad, so let's carry on. I have an update on my wayward ingredient order that was shipped priority mail 13 days ago from Tulsa. I talked about it last week. According to the UPS tracking, that box went from Tulsa to Fayetteville, Arkansas, to Mountain Home, Arkansas, back to Fayetteville, then to Ybor City, Florida, Memphis, Little Rock, back to Fayetteville, and then finally to Prairie Grove. In the meantime, Dave Knott at Small Batch Boutique in Broken Arrow knew that I needed to brew this beer, so he sent me another batch of the ingredients via UPS. The good news, I guess, is that the Postal Service package is damaged, so Dave will be able to be reimbursed, hopefully, for that second order. Many thanks to Dave at Small Batch Boutique in Broken Arrow, which is over near Tulsa, for the excellent service as always. You can always count on Dave. That recipe is the one that Matt Giovanisi, Josh Secor, and I came up with the last time that we were together. It's the honey IPA that called for lots of Centennial post-boil. I brewed that beer yesterday, and it went very well. The grain bill is all Pilsner. I boiled it without adding hops, adding a bunch of Centennial at a hop stand post-boil, And then I added, after that, some local honey from our beekeeper friend Caleb Hutcherson. The yeast that I used was A37 Pog from our friends and sponsors at Imperial Yeast. A37 Pog is the seasonal yeast through August from Imperial. It's Ebegarden Kveik, and it loves fermenting warm. I went to the beer fridge after brewing and chilling down my wort. I went to the beer fridge to get my packet of Pog that I've had for a long time. I've been looking forward to using it, and it was a little puffy. Turns out the date of manufacture on the Pog was March 20th. So it was technically just a little past the 4-month shelf life that Imperial recommends for their products. Well, I thought, what the heck? I bet this Pog will do just fine in this 1066 beer without a starter, so I pitched it into the 100-degree Fahrenheit or 37-degree Celsius wort at about 1:30 in the afternoon. By bedtime, the airlock had not moved. I was getting a little worried. However, by the time I got up this morning, it was perking along vigorously as expected, just blooping along. And I'm sure that it's now 87 degrees Fahrenheit outside, so it's probably just going like a steam train now. Should I have dusted off the stir plate? Well, I think the lower pitch rate of the Pog will produce some fun flavors, and it's obviously getting the job done. Usually, I don't make a starter for moderate gravity 5-gallon batches. Those 200 billion cells of Imperial yeast get to work in a hurry. Ask your local homebrewer store about getting some fresh A37 Pog from Imperial. Do it before it cools off. And check out all the dependable deliciousness at imperialyeast.com. That's imperialyeast.com. Okay, I've talked a lot. Let's talk to Peter Symons about the beginnings of Aussie beers and to get his take on what is lager. Peter Symons, welcome back to Basic Brewing Radio.
Good to be back, James.
Now, is this book number 4 that we've talked about?
It is book number 4, but it feels like book number 104. It's taken a long time.
Now, this is called True Blue Brews, and I have to say it slowly because I'll get tongue-tied. But the origins of Australian beer, and this is the kind of the third in a trilogy, right?
Yeah, I never ever thought I would be getting to the 4th volume. I must admit, when I started, I wrote Bronze Brews, and I thought, well, that's the extent of all the information I could find. But that wasn't actually true. And then I found more information, particularly from the Cooper's archive in Adelaide. And that formed the backbone of 6 O'Clock Brews, my second book. And because I'd been doing all this work in trying to compare the equal to best imported slogans, and best imported typically meant from the UK, I'd been to a lot of archives in England in particular, and also in Ireland, and gathered a lot of information, and that basically led to Gala Brews. So I thought, well, that's probably it. And then I realized that I knew more than I had actually put into Bronze Brews. So I did Bronze Brews second edition. So that's basically a new book. And in the background to all that, I'd been working on what I didn't originally call it the origins of Australian beer, because I hadn't really got the full picture. And I did the update to Bronze Brews, and then the COVID thing happened. Had a lot of additional time. I had a fair bit of time beforehand, but I had even more time and started wandering around the internet, looking for other influences on Australian beer. And as luck would have it, because I just paddle about and I drill down through various layers of indexes and stuff, I got to the stage where I realized in at Sydney University, they had a paper by a bloke called Augustus J. Metzler, and he'd written about his experiences of brewing in Australia. Now, I'd never heard of him before. So I started looking on Trove, which is the online newspaper archive in Australia, and I found lots of references to him. And I thought, oh, okay. He worked for a company called the Fordler Vacuum Fermentation Company.
Hmm.
More Googling, and I find there's an archive in Rochester, New York, that contains the papers of one of the head honchos of the what had become Fordler Inc., which still exists today in some form or another, and looked in the catalogue, and there were all sorts of interesting things. So I contacted the reference librarian, a lady called Autumn Haag. She's now the director, I think, of the library, and she very kindly photographed a range of relevant documents, and there were gigabytes of it. She did a really good job, and I'm totally appreciative of the effort that she put in to do that. And all of a sudden, I had all this background information of where Metzler had been in the US when he was testing and commissioning and training up brewers in using this new system, this new fermentation system. So that was about 6 months, six or 8 months worth of paddling around and putting things together. And then I realized that I had enough substance for True Blue Brews, which is a tongue twister. I realize that now. And then it all started coming together. And I was really close the middle of last year. I had enough content. It's difficult finding data from the 19th century, but I felt I had enough content to publish. And then I found out that in Adelaide, the South Australian Brewing Company, their archives, which I was aware of but had not been able to gain access to, the brewery had closed and the archives had been deposited in with the State Library of South Australia. And they were available. They weren't fully catalogued, but they were available. And I went last November and spent a few days going through and gleaning what I could glean. And then I struggled because I got back and I had a book that was almost ready, but I had all this really good stuff that needed to go somewhere. So I did about 2 or 3 cuts of putting things in and eventually landed on a split, which led to me updating 6 o'clock brews because it didn't all fit in True Blue Brews. And I needed to go somewhere. So whilst there may be in theory 4 books, in practice there's actually 6.
You're like those artists and bands who, re-release their albums every few years, with just, an additional cut. So completists, they have to buy them every time they come out.
Totally new remix, additional content, more recipes.
And a free poster.
Oh, I don't know whether I can do a free poster. That could be a bit much. This is more vinyl than anything else.
Well, you start from the beginning, the very beginning, and we those who know a little bit about history will know that the country of Australia began as a penal colony, and where brewing was not the primary objective down there. And so the brewers who started brewing faced a lot of challenges, not only from the kind and amount of equipment available, but also ingredients. And so the the shape of the economy, so to speak, and the shape of the land and the shape of the agriculture kind of shaped Australian beers from the very beginning, right?
Yeah, well, it's all it's because you lot got uppity and decided to have a war of independence that England needed somewhere to send their their convicts to, and so they chose the furthest end of the earth to do that. But yeah, just like all colonizing powers, they looked to exploit the land and and it was very hard. Agriculture. A lot of the people that came weren't experienced in agriculture. Uh, it was a lot easier to drink spirits, and for a long time, rum was the currency. There wasn't any currency, so you're talking a very primitive arrangement, and it did take a while to get any sort of beer brewing underway. Um, but it did take off eventually. The key ingredient was the use of sugar, because you can ferment sugar fairly readily, and that remains with us today. It took a while until sugar was grown in Australia, because again they had to find not only the techniques, they could get the techniques from people that had been working in the West Indies in particular, who came to Australia, and then they had to find the right sort of environment to be able to grow sugar. So it did take probably 50 odd years or so until indigenous, if you like, sugar was available. But global economy, no real problem in getting sugar from China, Indonesia, or at the time it was Java, India. So very much a trading economy, so that they were able to brew with sugar, and sometimes 100% sugar. So yeah, and sugar has remained the malt substitute of choice even today, because a lot of mainstream beers would probably use 20 to 25% sugar.
Wow. And this is not invert sugar, as we've talked about before. This is just, straight, basically table sugar.
Well, it's cane sugar, not necessarily because there's no, unlike Europe where there's a lot of beet sugar, this is cane sugar. Although in 6 o'clock brews with the update, I found more references to the use of invert sugar, but not in the 19th century. It was a lot easier for them to use raw sugar, which would be unrefined. So that would be a demerara sort of sugar in perhaps US terms. Here it's raw sugar you get in the supermarket.
And the use of sugar was important because the local grain that was grown in the beginning wasn't up to snuff as far as the usual standards were concerned.
No, they couldn't get it to grow. They couldn't grow barley. Barley was far too hard. Barley is quite a particular crop to grow. You need the right conditions. They found that they could grow maize a lot easier. And some of the data that I found from the early press reports gave an indication of the relative amounts of grains that they were growing, and maize topped the list, and wheat. So maize and wheat were a lot easier to grow in the local environment around the Hawkesbury River, which is to the northwest of Sydney. So they were able to grow some crops easier than others in the area that they were inhabiting at the time.
And you proposed trying to answer a question in this episode, and this is kind of background to get into that bigger question. The question that you want to answer is, what is a lager? And that's a big question, and it might be controversial. Let's see if we can stir up some some trouble.
Well, controversy corner for those who live in Australia was of a certain age. It was very much a football show where people had very diverse and forthright opinions.
We don't have those nowadays.
Oh, okay. We have the internet. We have the internet instead.
No, everybody's got one, and
Which
they all stink, right? No, that's something else.
Yeah.
But leading up to that question, you're talking about using a bunch of sugar in the beer, and people kind of comparing, Australian beers against, what they might have traditionally had in the past with, English or British beers. And there was a question that arose, and it was probably entangled in temperance at the time too, but of beer purity and what makes a pure beer and what makes a pure yeast. And so there was, on the one hand, there was kind of a strive toward keeping beer, quote unquote, pure. And there were accusations that, Australian beer had everything from strychnine to coriander, of all things. And and so there was a lot of talk about the testing of Australian beers and the kind of, Australian beers kind of being under sometimes literally the microscope as far as whether it was, quote unquote, pure or not.
Well, the pure beer question cropped up, and there's a pun there you'll find out in a moment, cropped up every decade or so. Pure beer has a lot of definitions. The agricultural lobby felt that the use of sugar meant that they were being denied the ability to grow more barley for malting purposes, and they lobbied that there should be no sugar in beer. So they lobbied the politicians, and the politicians do what they do, and commissioned a report. So they got an eminent chemist to look at it and pronounce that they couldn't really detect whether sugar had been used in a beer or not, generally speaking. But then you've got the other, as you've mentioned, the other purity aspect was adulteration. Oh, dreadful thing, adulteration. And yes, there probably was a level of adulteration, not necessarily by the brewers in every instance, but possibly also by the hotel keepers, either diluting or trying to save beer that had gone off by adding things. But the chemical science, the chemistry had advanced by the mid 1850s, 1860s. Use of the microscope, they were able to, whilst they didn't necessarily have standard methods of analysis, there was enough information there for them to determine whether there were strychnine or other contaminants in beer. One of the byproducts of using a lot of sugar is if you don't get your process right, you could get a lot of fusel alcohols. And they're the ones that give you perhaps the headiness in a beer. So your typical triple X colonial ale, probably 6 to 8%. Around the middle of the 19th century, and you'd get a good buzz from it. And depending on how good the brewer was, you might get additional fusel alcohols, which would make it very heady indeed. So there was this emphasis on pure beer. But do you need a pure yeast to give you a pure beer? That's another question.
Hmm. And that had proponents and opponents as well. I mean, in a time where they were just discovering, what yeast was and being able to isolate single strains of yeast, to give a more stable product, to give a more predictable product. You would think that all brewers would be excited about this technology, but there were some that wanted to stick with the old ways of, basically a mixed culture in their beers and, kind of unpredictability and instability over time. It maybe shouldn't surprise me, but it surprises me that, the professional brewers at that time would be resistant to, this kind of advancement in technology.
Well, the I think most listeners would be aware that Pasteur had shown the way of the impact of yeast on actual fermentation, and then Emil Christian Hansen did the application to actually identify particular yeast strains, and then you've got Jorgensen who developed propagation equipment, and all this took place 1870s, 1880s, and the brewing was mostly a fraternity at the time, very experiential brewers. If it worked last time, we'll do it again the same way. Very conservative in the way they do things, creatures of habit. If you've got good beer, don't do anything to change it. You don't want to upset the clients because the beer's gone off because you've changed it. A lot of resistance for some valid reasons, but they were reliant on having a dominant brewing strain that would outcompete bacteria, wild yeast, all sorts of stuff that were probably in the brewery.
Mm-hmm. And some, I guess, some of that partnership of that, that kind of stew of microorganisms might have been beneficial because one strain of yeast might be good in, primary fermentation, and another strain of yeast might, pick up the slack when it comes to, conditioning the beer over time or something. But then you've got all the baddies in there as well that'll sour the beer or make it taste off over time. So I guess with any change, there's going to be resistance. Even positive change is stressful.
Well, yes, and given that the Danes are around, typically around the Carlsberg laboratories and brewery, had led the way in. Basically, what Hansen was doing was diluting a sample of yeast and kept on diluting until it got to a particular strain, and then they do brewing trials to see if it gave a decent flavor. The flavor being one requirement. Does it flocculate out properly if you're doing sort of cask beer, which most beer was at that stage in draft form? If you're doing export beers, how are you going to deal with the secondary conditioning? Is that secondary conditioning coming from torula like Brettanomyces or other strains? So he did work initially on bottom fermenting yeast, and I'm going to use the terms bottom and top fermenting yeast, which were the terminology of the day and still exists today, although it's perhaps not quite so clear cut between what's top and what's bottom when you use cylindroconical fermenters. The other factor that we need to bear in mind today is the amount of genomic testing and DNA of yeast that's gone on in particularly the last 10 years or so. where they've actually identified that some inverted commas ale yeasts are actually inverted commas lager yeast and vice versa. So the idea that you would use a lager yeast is somewhat of a misnomer because it might actually be an ale yeast. If you do it in the top and bottom fermentation, you've got some physical characteristics that you could identify the differences. To add to the complexity, because this isn't a binary thing. Uh, uh, Lager and ale, uh, it's not uh, it's not binary. It's not one or t'other. There's hybrids. What about steam beer?
Hmm.
You know that's uh, a bottom fermented yeast fermented warm, as opposed to a top fermented yeast. You can have top fermenting yeasts that are fermented cool. Uh, so yeah, and of course we got Kvike,
Yeah. And you talked
which
about a a company called the ST Ferment Company Limited in 1903 that worked with a process and a yeast strain that that certainly reminded me of Kvike. Talk about them.
yeah the for those of you who have read Bronze Brews, uh, there was quite a lot about Grove Johnson, a brewing chemist who came to Australia in the early 1900s. And he also patented a process using Saccharomyces thermantonium, ST. Uh, this process used a yeast that had a lot of characteristics of Kvike, a bottom fermenting Kvike, because you can get both bottom and top Kvikes. And what he was very much a salesman. So he was selling this as a ideal yeast to use in places like India and Australia because you could ferment at 40 degrees C or even 49 degrees C.
Now we're
So
talking around 120 degrees Fahrenheit.
yeah, in old money, yes. Yeah.
And I pitched, my last Kvike I pitched at 100 degrees Fahrenheit, a 37 C, and thought that was crazy. Now we're hotter than that.
Yeah, this strain still exists. It's in a yeast bank in the Netherlands or Belgium or one or the other or both. And it'd be nice if somebody actually paid the money and propagated that up and gave it a whirl because it the claims that he put forward is you didn't need to chill. You only had to do a very moderate amount of chilling. You could probably use groundwater to get down to pitching temperature at 40 odd degrees centigrade. Um, you you got your fermentation done in a couple of days. You could produce a range of beers. You could do ales, stouts, lagers, uh, all of which tasted okay. Now we don't know for sure whether okay was okay. It does strike me that if you've never had a particular style before and you're in a colonial country, if you're presented with something that's called a lager that's different from your normal drinking ale, you'll accept that, I suspect, as being a lager as a different beer, whether or no it would actually match up with a more traditional European, Germanic, Teutonic lager style like a Munich or a Helles or a Bohemian Pils. You wouldn't know about those things. You've just been presented with a beer that's different. And if it'd been generated by a different process, you're not to know, are you?
Yeah, so if I ferment a beer with ST yeast at 45C, and it's a bottom fermenting yeast, or if I ferment a Kvike at 37C, 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's a bottom fermenting Kvike, is it a lager?
Well, of course it is. Bottom fermenting yeast. No, not. Well, that comes down to what is a lager, and a lot of people have made very. Well, let me go back. So, I'd actually looked into this question quite extensively. Now, different eras have different ideas about what things are, and that's important to put in place. So Noonan, who wrote the New Brewing Lager Beer book, which is pretty much a standard, mid-90s, 90s as in 20th century 90s.
The 1900s.
Yes. He very much put forward the traditional styles from Munich and etc. And it was defined by the process, which was a period of cold conditioning, where that cold conditioning originally in the olden days, caves with ice that had been hacked out of a lake or gathered during the winter, and in more later times, artificial or mechanical refrigeration. So from, say, the 1880s, 1890s onwards, for some of the bigger breweries. So that did require a period of cold conditioning to drop out the yeast, clean the beer up, very much driven by the way they did things in Germany and at the time Bohemia. So that was custom and practice to do it that way. Is that a lager? Well, it's been lagered, and it used a bottom fermenting yeast that, as we've discussed, over time had been refined to being a single strain pure bottom fermenting yeast. So you've got a single strain yeast, pure bottom, and you're making pure bottom that's been lagered. Now, how's that going to deal with your hypothetical Kvike that's a pure bottom, and the way they have released, at least commercially, Kvike, it's not a mixed strain yeast. It's actually a single strain that's been selected. Mm-hmm. That's my understanding anyway, that you've got a pure bottom single strain yeast. Now, if you were to cold condition that for a period, have you not got a lager?
Some would argue yes. Some would argue no.
And that's why it's controversial.
Now, behind me in the studio is a batch of beer that I'm calling a malt liquor, an American malt liquor that I brewed the other day. I used brew in a bag, and I used an infusion mash, single-step infusion mash, and I collected my wort. Now, I did chill down to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, which is what, around 12 C, something like that, and pitched the yeast cold and fermented it at that same temperature. And now I'm doing a diacetyl rest out here in the open. So I didn't do a decoction. I didn't do a traditional quote unquote lager, technique to brew the beer. So whether in some people's minds that this would not be a lager, I don't know. And it's
you've cunningly introduced a new term, a malt liquor. Mm.
I read it in your book. It's not. It's not a
They
new.
were very keen on beverages and malt liquors and things. Yeah, yeah. Well, there's all sorts of things. There's a lot of stuff in the book. Where this is uh, uh, just a few little nuggets here, little nuggets. So what you've got there then is you've got all the elements of lagering, but you then said that you had not done a decoction.
Hmm.
Well, why were they doing decoctions? They were doing decoctions because their malt was under modified.
Right.
If you've got well modified malt, you don't need to decoct. Now I can hear all the people going, "Oh, you can't do that." But it's tradition. You've got all this tradition that says you must do it this way. You don't have to do it this way. The the brewers in the 19th century weren't constrained by having to do things a particular way. They chose a particular way because it worked for them. Now, whether that's because they'd been scientifically trained or whether they were experiential brewers, they knew what they were doing. There was always good and bad brewers, but the good brewers knew what they were doing and were able to make repeatable beer. Uh, there's no joy in selling sour beer. You need to produce proper beer, whatever you want to call it, top or bottom, lager or ale. You've still got to produce something that's saleable. So what you've got there is, if you want to do a traditional way of making a lager, that's perfectly fine, but it's not the only way.
Is it defined by style? Is it a lager because it's a pilsner, or a Märzen or an Oktoberfest, or other traditional lager styles? If I, like, say, take Kvike and do, as I've done, a pilsner on my hot porch in the summertime, and it tastes pretty much like a pilsner, is it not a lager because it's been fermented on the porch, or is it a lager because it's a pilsner?
Yes. Well, let me ask you, the pilsner. Did the pilsner have a fruity finish, or was it more sulfury, DMS-y sort of thing?
It was probably between the two. I mean, it certainly had. If I'm going off of memory now, I'd have to go back and look at the video. But it didn't have a large hop presence because there was probably only bittering hops added at the beginning of the boil. It had a nice grainy, pilsnery malt flavor to it. I mean, it might have had a little bit of fruitiness from the Kvike. I'll have to go back and look at which strain I used, but it wasn't like, oh, this tastes like mango. It was like, oh, this tastes like a pilsner.
Well, you've obviously used proper traditional hops rather than some of the fruit salady ones now available
from your part of the world.
Yeah, New Zealand. Yeah, they've got full of them now.
Your neighbors.
Yeah. Well,
I think it was
Galaxy's fairly fruity as well. Yeah,
it's probably Czech Sots is probably what I used. So,
yeah. So, I think Sats or Hallertau, independent of the type of yeast you're using, is going to give you the impression of a lagery type beer, because that's what people tend to expect. If you cold condition the beer for a period, and I've noticed this with ales as well, they become cleaner. Some of the hop character disappears, and you get a more lager-like flavor and aroma. So because there's so many yeasts that are not actually one or t'other, they're actually hybrids and from their DNAs, then what other flavor characteristics are there then? Flavor characteristics from malting hops, possibly. Uh, a lot of the descriptors that you see in style guidelines talk about crispness, whatever that might be. Crispness, and I'm not talking crisp mass, but crispness. Um, is it the level of carbonation? Is it the spritziness, the fizziness you're getting from the drink?
Is it the dryness? Is it the IBU level? As opposed to the perception of sweetness. Yeah, it seems like there are several adjectives or characteristics that could be fit under crisp.
Yes. So we've got the situation in Australia that most people would regard. If you go to the pub today and you ask for a beer, most people think that beer is a lager, no matter how it's been produced. It probably hasn't been produced with any fancy decoction because that's inefficient. It's probably some sort of rising infusion mash that gets the job done quickly. It's probably got a large amount of sugar in it still. It doesn't have a lot of hopping. It's cold, wet, and it's fizzy. And that's what people would regard as a lager. There are several examples in Australia that meet that criteria. But they're not lagers in the European sense. They're more like your uh, Bud Miller Coors. Different, but that sort of it's just a commercial beer for drinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess the question is why does it matter?
Well, I don't think that the way you achieve the result, i.e., the process, is not the determining factor. The determining factor is it's what the consumer actually thinks a lager is. Now, whether that's a consumer in Europe thinking that yeah, that's a good Helles, that's this, or whether it's a consumer in a bar in Sydney having a new or a VB, if that's what they think is a lager, it's a lager. It's not actually what yeast is used, what process is used. It's what the customer thinks. So that's a bit tricky, but that's where I think this discussion will end up.
Now, of course, on the beer, I don't want to say snob, but the beer nerd side of things, those who enter competitions and try to fit beers into different categories, and it takes a lot of skill to do that properly. And whereas I don't enter competition, so it doesn't matter to me as much, what my beer is, just so that it's tasty. Then if you're really trying to fit certain characteristics of a certain style in order to compete in a competition like that, maybe for them, the name tags mean a lot more.
Yeah, I'd say so and I think that's one of the difficulties with the generic light lager, the nuance between a light lager of a certain strength and a different strength with slightly different ingredients is very hard to pick, and judging guidelines are there to try and provide some guidance as to the differentiation between very similar styles of beer. I think there's very much a difference between the way beer competitions for commercial breweries are judged, in that they tend to be judged on more from a consumer perspective. This is my take on it. and perhaps not down in the weeds looking for, is the carbonation right? Is lots of other factors that go into judging a beer. Ultimately, is what it tastes like, and you're trying to pick out, other than the faults, what differentiates one style from another. I think you can make a pretty good facsimile of a light lager using either any of the yeasts that we've talked about.
Mm-hmm.
As long as you actually have a good clean process and you ferment it out properly. The fermentation is all. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if we stuck
So
with
God.
if we stuck with the original definition, we'd still be lagering in caves. So, with ice that had been cut from a river, or a lake. So, you can't ignore the advances of technology. And so your contention is that it's the end product and not the process that's the key.
I believe so, because that's what the consumer thinks, and even the judges, the judging of beer, and whether BJCP or other, it's what's in the glass, not how you got there.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
So if people want to argue with you or debate you, where can they find you, Peter?
I'm hiding.
Well, they definitely need to find your book. We just scratched the surface of it, and as in the other books, you've included historical or modern recreations of historical recipes of commercial beers with modern ingredients designed for a brewer of today to brew, which is always interesting. True.
Yeah, for those that like to actually follow the recipe, yes. For others, it's some guidelines for experimentation.
You talking to me?
Couldn't possibly comment.
True Blue Brews, The Origins of Australian Beer. Where can they find your book?
You can find the book on Lulu, which is a print-on-demand service. They do publish on various social medias discount codes periodically. The last one they had was for 15% off, so it's probably worthwhile looking out for those. It makes no odds to me. I don't know where they're getting the 15% from, and it's not coming from me. But all the books are available on Lulu, and I'm sure James, you'll put the link in the description somewhere.
In the description of this episode, it's lulu.com, and Peter Symons is Symons. So
correct.
That should get you there.
It should do. I've got a YouTube channel where I put a few things up. I'm likely to post a few more. There's things that didn't make the book that I think are interesting, but are probably better off done in a more visual sense. So I've put a few things up on there. That's Triton Books.
The Triton Books on YouTube.
Tritun.
There you go. Triton, as in three.
Triton.
3 tons.
Correct.
I got it.
A lot of people don't, but I think it's all in the context.
Some people think I'm as thick as your book, but that's I get things every now and then. Peter, it's always fun to talk to you, whether it's online or in person. So I haven't seen you in a while, but maybe one of us needs to make a trip somewhere, or maybe we can meet in between, maybe in lager country in Germany,
Hawaii.
They make lagers in Maui, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, sure they do.
All right, Peter. Thank you, sir. We will talk to you next time.
Thanks, James. Pleasure as always.
Many thanks, as always, to Peter. I'll put a link to Peter's book in the episode description on basicbrewingradio.com. Or you can go straight to lulu.com, that's LULU.com, and search for Peter Symons, Symons, to see all of his books available for print on demand. Fun stuff, especially if you like history and recreating historic beers. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to James at basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. Check out our mobile-friendly shop at basicbrewingshop.com. Thanks to everybody supporting us through our Patreon page. Special goodies coming your way. Check that at patreon.com/basicbrewing. So until next time, till then, thanks for listening, everybody. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. In the meantime, stay well, stay tuned. So long.